There exists a pattern of behavior so deeply woven into the fabric of human interaction that most never recognize it as a cage. It is the relentless drive to justify every choice, every emotion, every moment of withdrawal or silence. On the surface, this seems like consideration, like empathy extended toward those who share your life. But beneath the veneer of politeness lies something far more troubling. A fracture in the foundation of self, a wound that never properly healed. This compulsion to explain yourself is not born from strength. It emerges from environments where your internal world was treated as unreliable evidence, where what you felt was subjected to constant by others who decided whether your experience deserved to exist. The child who cried and was told to stop being dramatic learned a brutal lesson. The child who expressed anger and was labeled difficult absorbed a dangerous truth. The child who showed fear and received mockery instead of comfort began building an architecture of doubt around their own perceptions. What forms in these moments is not merely insecurity. It is a fundamental distortion of psychological reality. The developing mind concludes that feelings require external authorization, that inner experience holds no inherent validity. A defensive structure emerges. If I can explain well enough, if I can make them understand, perhaps I will be safe. Perhaps I will not be dismissed, ridiculed, or abandoned. This becomes the template carried forward into every relationship, every interaction, every moment of potential conflict. The adult who cannot stop justifying themselves is still that child, still seeking the permission they were denied. They enter conversations already positioned in defense, anticipating the need to prove that what they feel has legitimate cause. They preemptively build cases for their emotions as if appearing before a tribunal that will determine whether they deserve to feel what they feel. The exhaustion of this is profound, yet invisible to those trapped within it. What makes this pattern so insidious is its disguise. Society rewards those who can articulate their reasoning, who avoid conflict through careful explanation, who smooth over tension by justifying their position until others relent. This creates the illusion that the behavior serves you, that it protects relationships, that it demonstrates maturity. But the truth cuts deeper. Every explanation offered from a place of fear is a small betrayal of self, a moment where you prioritize being understood over being authentic. The cost accumulates slowly. You begin to lose touch with your own authority, that internal compass that should guide decisions without requiring consensus. You stop trusting your instincts because they have been overruled so many times by the need to make sense to others. Your emotional landscape becomes something you observe through the lens of potential judgment rather than something you simply inhabit. You are no longer the primary authority on your own experience. Others hold that position, and you spend your energy trying to convince them to validate what you already know to be true. This creates a particular kind of prison. The bars are invisible, constructed entirely from the belief that your existence requires approval. You cannot feel anger without providing reasons that others will accept. You cannot say no without building an argument that preempts criticism. You cannot change your mind without explaining the process in detail to avoid being seen as inconsistent. You cannot be tired, sad, distant, or uncertain without offering a narrative that others can understand, and therefore permit. The mechanism at work here is the attempt to control how others perceive you. If you can explain yourself thoroughly enough, perhaps they will not judge you harshly. Perhaps they will not withdraw their affection. Perhaps they will not decide you are too much, too sensitive, too difficult, too anything. But this attempt at control is actually an abdication of power. You hand over the keys to your sense of self and ask others to decide whether you deserve to occupy space in the world as you are. What you are unconsciously communicating with each compulsive justification is this: I can only exist if you allow it. My internal reality requires your signature of approval to be legitimate. I do not trust myself enough to simply be, so I must constantly prove that my being makes sense according to your standards. This is not connection. This is not consideration. This is the slow erosion of psychological autonomy, traded away in exchange for the temporary relief of being understood. A pattern perpetuates itself because it never actually achieves what it seeks. No amount of explanation can fill the void left by the absence of self-trust. You can justify yourself perfectly, can articulate every nuance of your position, can build an airtight case for why you feel what you feel, and still the underlying anxiety remains. Because the problem is not that others fail to understand. The problem is that you have outsourced your right to exist without explanation. You have accepted the premise that your inner world requires external validation to be real. This is where the transformation must begin. Not with better explanations, not with more persuasive arguments, not with finding the right words to make others see your perspective. The shift occurs when you recognize that the compulsion itself is the problem, that every justification reinforces the belief that you need permission to be who you are. The wound cannot heal while you continue to seek approval for your existence. It can only heal when you begin to reclaim the authority you gave away, when you start to understand that your experience is valid simply because it is yours. But this recognition is only the beginning. The path from understanding to embodiment requires confronting everything you have built your sense of safety upon. It demands that you face the fear of being misunderstood, of being judged, of being rejected for simply existing without explanation. It asks you to sit with the discomfort of silence when every instinct screams at you to justify, to clarify, to make others understand. This is not easy work. It is the work of reclaiming yourself from the prison you did not know you were building, one explanation at a time. The act of constantly explaining yourself is not a single moment of weakness. It is a sustained campaign of self-abandonment, carried out in small increments across years of interactions. Each time you reshape your words to avoid causing discomfort, each time you suppress genuine emotion to maintain artificial harmony, each time you edit your truth to make it more acceptable, you betray yourself. The betrayal is quiet, almost imperceptible, but its cumulative effect is devastating. Consider the ordinary moments where this occurs. You laugh at something you find unfunny because the room expects it. You agree when you actually disagree because voicing opposition feels dangerous. You describe your sadness as mere tiredness because admitting the depth of what you feel might burden others. You reframe your anger as rational concern because raw emotion seems too vulnerable, too exposed. In each instance, you make a choice: the comfort of others over the integrity of self. And with each choice, the distance between who you are and who you present yourself to be grows wider. This fragmentation of identity does not happen dramatically. There is no moment where you suddenly lose yourself. Instead, it occurs through accumulation, through the steady erosion of internal authority. You begin to doubt your own perceptions because you have overridden them so many times in favor of what others might find acceptable. Your intuition, once clear, becomes muddied by the constant need to justify it rationally. You stop asking what you actually feel and start asking what you can reasonably explain feeling. The authentic self, the one that exists before justification, becomes buried beneath layers of adaptation. What drives this pattern is the ego operating in service of external acceptance rather than internal truth. The ego, which should function as the organizing center of conscious experience, instead becomes a performer, constantly adjusting its presentation based on the perceived expectations of its audience. It learns to read rooms, to anticipate judgments, to preemptively defend against criticism. It becomes skilled at manufacturing explanations that will be well received, at packaging genuine experience into forms that others can comfortably consume. But this skill comes at a price: the loss of connection to the deeper self, to the source of authentic feeling and knowing that exists beyond the need for approval. The world encourages this disconnection. People who adapt smoothly, who explain themselves well, who avoid confrontation through careful justification are praised as mature, as considerate, as easy to be around. But beneath this socially sanctioned harmony often lies profound exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of those who have spent years performing their own lives, who have edited every authentic impulse to fit the expectations of others, who have become so practiced at justification that they no longer remember what it feels like to simply be without explanation. This internal division creates psychological symptoms that seem unrelated to their source. Chronic anxiety emerges not from external circumstances, but from the constant monitoring of how you might be perceived. Existential emptiness appears because you have spent so long being what others need that you no longer know what you actually are. Decision-making becomes paralyzed because you have lost access to the internal authority that should guide choices. Self-esteem crumbles because it has been built on the unstable foundation of external validation rather than rooted in genuine self-knowledge. The question that cuts through all of this is simple but brutal. Whose life are you actually living? If every action requires justification, if every emotion must be explained to be permitted, if every boundary needs a detailed defense to be respected, then you are not living your own life. You are performing a version of yourself that has been carefully edited for public consumption. You have become a character in someone else's narrative, always reactive, always adjusting, always seeking permission to exist as you are. Breaking this pattern requires the development of something that has been systematically eroded: internal authority. This is not arrogance or disregard for others. It is the capacity to validate your own experience without needing external confirmation. It is the ability to know what you feel, what you need, what you will accept, and to hold that knowing even when others do not understand, even when they disagree, even when they respond with judgment or withdrawal. Internal authority begins with a shift in the fundamental question you ask yourself. Instead of wondering whether others will understand what you feel, you begin to assert that it does not matter whether they understand. What matters is that your experience is real for you. This shift is existential, not merely intellectual. It represents a change in where the center of your psychological world resides. The axis moved from the periphery of external approval back to the core of self, to the place where your truth exists before it is shaped for others. This transition demands courage, because it means confronting every fear that the compulsion to explain has been protecting you from. The fear of abandonment, the fear of judgment, the fear of being fundamentally unacceptable as you are. These fears have driven the need for explanation, have convinced you that if you can just make people understand, you will be safe. But safety purchased through constant justification is not real safety. It is a fragile peace built on the suppression of self, and it cannot hold. Developing internal authority means learning to sustain your truth even when it creates discomfort. It means saying no without providing a list of reasons why. It means changing your mind without feeling obligated to explain the entire process of your thinking. It means ending conversations when they no longer serve you, not out of rudeness, but simply because you recognize that you owe nothing to anyone as payment for your existence. It means holding boundaries firmly without apology, without justification, without the elaborate explanations that seek to preemptively manage others' reactions. In practice, this looks like small daily acts of self-reclamation. It is the moment you feel provoked and choose silence instead of defense. It is the instance where someone demands an explanation and you quietly decline to provide one. It is the decision to trust your discomfort with a situation, even when you cannot articulate exactly why you feel it. It is the refusal to participate in emotional games, where you must constantly justify your position to maintain your right to it. It is the willingness to be misunderstood and to remain whole anyway. This is the beginning of true psychological freedom. Not freedom from others, but freedom from the need for others to approve of you before you approve of yourself. Not isolation, but the end of negotiating your essence to purchase belonging. Not coldness, but the warmth that can only emerge when you stop betraying yourself and begin to occupy your life as someone who knows they have the right to be here, exactly as they are, without explanation. When silence emerges from integrity rather than avoidance, it carries a weight that words never could. This is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but of someone who no longer needs to say anything to justify their existence. It is presence without explanation, authority without argument, selfhood without apology. And this silence transforms everything it touches because it deactivates the entire machinery of psychological control that has fed on your insecurity. The impact of this silence on those around you is immediate and unsettling. People who have grown accustomed to your justifications, who have expected you to explain yourself, to adjust yourself, to defend yourself, suddenly encounter a wall they cannot penetrate. Your refusal to engage in the old pattern is interpreted as defiance because, in essence, it is. Not the loud defiance of rebellion, but the quiet defiance of someone who has decided they will no longer participate in their own diminishment. You are saying, without saying anything at all, that you owe no explanations for being who you are. This disrupts relationships built on imbalance. Those who have benefited from your doubt, who have maintained control through your need to be understood, lose their leverage. Manipulation requires a response, requires the target to care deeply about being misunderstood, to fear abandonment enough to adjust. But secure silence offers nothing to work with. It does not defend, does not justify, does not dance to anyone's tune. It simply stands immovable, and in that stance communicates everything. I am whole without your approval. Relationships begin to reorganize themselves around this new reality. Some connections deepen because they were always based on genuine respect, on mutual recognition between two whole people. These relationships improve when you stop explaining yourself because they no longer carry the burden of your need for validation. Communication becomes cleaner, more honest, less cluttered with the defensive preambles that once preceded every authentic expression. You can simply say what is true for you and trust that it will be received or not, accepted or not, without your worth depending on the outcome. Other relationships dissolve, and this is not failure, but necessary realignment. Connections that depended on your submission, on your predictability, on your willingness to make yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's need for control, cannot survive your refusal to play that role anymore. When you stop explaining yourself, you break the implicit contract that kept these relationships functioning. You are no longer available to be shaped, to be managed, to be the one who always yields. And for some, this is unacceptable. Their departure is not a loss. It is clarification. Your silence functions as a filter, revealing who is present out of genuine connection and who is there because you are easy to control, easy to guilt, easy to make responsible for their emotional comfort. This can be painful to discover, but it is essential. The relationships that remain after you stop justifying yourself are the ones worth having, the ones built on foundation, solid enough to withstand your wholeness rather than requiring your fragmentation. But the external transformation is only part of what occurs. Internally, something even more profound begins to happen. When you stop explaining yourself to others, you create space to finally hear yourself. The constant outward focus, the endless monitoring of how you might be perceived, the exhausting work of preemptive justification, all of this falls away. And in the quiet that remains, you can begin to feel what you actually feel without immediately translating it into terms that others will accept. This internal listening is where true integration occurs. You stop rationalizing your emotions and start inhabiting them fully. You cease questioning whether your boundaries are reasonable and begin simply holding them. You no longer need to build a case for your choices because you recognize that your life is not a trial requiring a verdict from others. The energy that once went toward external justification turns inward toward the work of understanding yourself, of honoring your truth, of building a relationship with your own depths that does not depend on anyone else as permission or comprehension. Psychological integrity settles in as you practice this new way of being. Integrity here means coherence, the alignment between what you feel and what you express, between what you know to be true for you and how you move through the world. It is the opposite of the fragmentation that comes from constant adaptation, from editing yourself to fit what others expect. An integrated person does not negotiate their essence. They do not fragment to please. They remain whole, even when that wholeness is uncomfortable for others to witness. This integrity manifests as a presence that others can sense, even without understanding its source. There is something unmistakable about a person who is not seeking approval, who is not trying to convince anyone of anything, who simply exists from a center that does not waver based on external response. This presence commands respect not through force, but through solidity. It establishes boundaries without confrontation, because the boundaries are not defended with words, but embodied in being. It invites authentic connection, because it offers no false version of self, nothing performed, nothing edited for consumption. The world begins to treat you differently when you occupy this space, not because you have changed what you say, but because you have changed what you emanate. You no longer broadcast the frequency of someone who needs permission. You transmit the signal of someone who has given themselves permission and no longer requires it from anyone else. People respond to this shift unconsciously. They test less, push less, demand less, because they sense that you are not available for the games that require your doubt as fuel. This does not mean you become closed or rigid. It means you become clear. You can engage in dialogue without needing to win it. You can listen to perspectives different from yours without feeling threatened by them. You can be flexible where flexibility serves you without being malleable in ways that betray you. The difference is that you are no longer operating from a place of fear, no longer moving through the world as someone who must constantly justify their right to occupy it. The transformation is complete when you realize that the silence, the refusal to explain, has become natural rather than effortful. You no longer have to remind yourself to stop justifying, because justification no longer occurs to you as necessary. You have reclaimed the internal authority that was always yours, that was only ever on loan to those who convinced you it needed their signature to be valid. And from this place of wholeness, everything changes. Not just how others see you, but how you inhabit your own life, finally, as someone who belongs to themselves.